Shabbat Shalom. This story is told of a certain man who was once really successful in business, really doing a wonderful job in his career, when all of a sudden he fell on hard times. His companies were in trouble, he was in trouble, and really his financial situation was in a bad place. So he did what we are supposed to do when we are struggling. He went to his rabbi. And he said, "Rabbi, I'm really struggling, I'm having a hard time, my business is in trouble. What should I do?" The rabbi said, "I want you to go home. I want you to take out your Tanakh, your Hebrew Bible, and I want you to just open it. And whatever page you open the Bible to, whatever instruction is written right there, that's exactly what I want you to do. That's how you're going to get out of the jam that you find yourself in right now." So sure enough, about a year passes, and the rabbi hadn't seen this man. When now a year later, all of a sudden the man comes back, and the rabbi goes up to him and says, "Oh, it's so good to see you. How are you? Tell me, how are things going?" And the man says, "Rabbi, you're brilliant. Things are going great. My life has turned around, my career has turned around, business is going great, and I'm making all this money." The rabbi says, "I'm so thrilled to hear about your success. Tell me, what was it that you found in the Bible when you went home that allowed everything to turn around?" So the man said, "Rabbi, I did exactly what you told me. I went straight home, and I knew that wherever I opened my Bible to, it would solve all of my financial problems. So sure enough, I went straight home, I opened my Tanakh, my Hebrew Bible, and there, the very first thing I saw, that's the exact instruction that I followed." "Knew?" the rabbi said. "What did you see?" The man said, "Well, the very first thing I opened to was chapter 11. I'm not going to have you just open to a random spot in the Bible, but I'll invite you to join me on a very specifically guided tour of our Torah portion this week, Parashat Eikev." And so here we are, again, Moses is addressing our ancestors, the Israelites, before they're about to enter the Promised Land without him. And Moses is giving our people essentially Judaism's greatest hits. He's saying, here are the most important things you need to remember and take with you as you cross the Jordan River and begin to settle Eretz Yisrael, the Promised Land of Israel. So here we are in Deuteronomy chapter 9. You're welcome to follow along in the Hebrew and the fine print. I'll do so in the English if you don't mind. "And when the Lord your God has thrust your enemies from your path," Moses says, "say not to yourselves, 'The Lord has enabled us to possess this land because of our virtues.' It is rather because of the wickedness of those nations that the Lord is dispossessing them before you. It is not because of your virtues," Moses says to the Israelites. "It is not because of your virtues and your goodness that you'll be able to possess the land of Israel, but it's because of their wickedness that the Lord your God is dispossessing those nations before you. And in order to fulfill the oath that the Lord made to your fathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Know then that it is not for any virtue of yours that the Lord your God is giving you this good land to possess, for you are a stiff-necked people." Here we are, 3 times God tells us we don't deserve the land of Israel. We don't deserve the special covenant. We don't deserve the love that God is showing us in bringing us from slavery to freedom. We don't deserve what God is giving us. Nevertheless, God loves us. Nevertheless, God shows not only love, not only that emotion capability, but God promises to take care of us. God promises to give us what we need to survive. Of course, elsewhere in our Torah portion it says, "Man may not live on bread alone," but all that God provides us, that's what we need to live on. And so here we see that God is practicing what I'm calling unwarranted love. There's no basis for God's love for the Jewish people. Yes, God had a special relationship with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and they operated on a whole nother spiritual plane. But we're schleppers. We don't fulfill the mitzvot in the same way that Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob did. We don't have that special relationship to God the way they did. Nevertheless, God promises to take care of us, to provide for us because of unwarranted love. There's no real justification. We don't deserve it, Moses reminds us. Nevertheless, God is going to shower us with love and take care of us with all that we need. Just as God practices unwarranted love, so too should we. And here we are in Deuteronomy chapter 10. For the Lord your God is God supreme and Lord supreme, great, the mighty, and the awesome God, who shows no favor and takes no bribe, but upholds the cause of the orphan and the widow, and befriends the stranger, providing him or her with food and clothing. Therefore, it's implied, you too must befriend the stranger, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. You must revere the Lord your God. Only God shall you worship. To God shall you hold fast, and by God's name shall you swear. God is your glory, and Hashem is your God, who wrought for you those marvelous, awesome deeds that you saw with your own eyes. Your ancestors went down to Egypt, 70 persons in all. And now the Lord your God has made you as numerous as the stars in heaven. And here we transition to chapter 11, as it were, and begins with verse 1. Love, therefore, the Lord your God, and always keep God's charge, God's laws, God's rules, and God's commands. If you look in the Hebrew in the fine print, chapter 11, verse 1, it says, V'ahavta et Hashem Elokecha. You shall love the Lord your God. We know this idea. We say it twice a day, every day. Right? Taken from Shema, and the verse that immediately follows it. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your might. We know this commandment, and we know it well. But in the ancient world, the idea of ahava, the idea of love, was not a romantic love like we might know in modern-day America or the Western world. The idea of love as practiced in the ancient world had everything to do with covenant. When you loved someone, you were obligated to them. When you loved someone, you were obligated to them. You were obligated to take care of them. You were obligated to provide for them. You were obligated to do for them what they needed you to do. And so here when it says in our Torah, V'ahavta het Hashem Elokecha, you shall love the Lord your God. We're given very specific ways to love God. And we know from the Shema, right, when it begins, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your might. It tells us very specifically what we're supposed to do to show our love for God. I'll put you on quiz. What are some of the things it says in the V'ahavta that we must do as part of our love for God? Exactly right. We're supposed to teach Torah to our kids. When we teach Torah to our kids, we are thereby showing our love for God. What else? All right, Sally's my ringer. Good. So when you're walking, you should share words of Torah. When you go to bed and when you wake up, you should say the Shema. You should proclaim God's oneness. Good. And then, of course, we've got tefillin in there. We've got mezuzah in there. All of these things that we owe to God, all of the mitzvot that we fill, it's because of our love for God. Love equals obligation in Judaism. Love equals obligation. So if we come back up earlier a few verses, and here I am in verse 18, it says, Ve'ohev ger. And in verse 19 it says, Ve'ahavtam et hager. Again, the same words. You shall love the ger, translated here as stranger. You shall love the strangers. Now the text here, the English translation, tries to reflect this idea of obligation by changing the word from love to befriend. Right? Because when you have a friend, you have obligations to take care of a friend. So they use the and befriend the stranger. You too must befriend the stranger in verses 18 and 19. Some sense of obligation, of that which we need to do in order to take care of another. Now again, I want to take you back to the ancient world. There were concentric circles of obligation, concentric circles of love in the ancient world. Those we were most obligated to love were our family. Right? Our immediate family. After all, it says, are you your brother's keeper? And the answer, of course, is yes. So the immediate circle is our family. Then you come out a circle, and it's in our extended family. You come out yet another circle, and it's the entire Jewish people. You come out yet another circle, and it's the ger, it's the stranger. Now, what our ancestors knew was not totally distant strangers. The ger here to which they're referring are the non-Jews living among them. That's to whom they're referring. The non-Jews who were living them among them, perhaps in the house next to them, perhaps a few blocks over, as it were. Right? But this ger, the stranger to which they're referring, are the non-Jews who had chosen to live peacefully and in relationship with the Jews who were in the land. That's who the strangers were. And then, of course, outside of those concentric circles, all the Israelites knew, all our ancestors knew, were enemies. There was no such thing as a middle ground of those we don't know but aren't our enemies. Right? So those are the concentric circles of obligation that goes back to the ancient world. And here, in a most profound and transformative way, God says, just as I, God, took care of you, Jewish people, when you were strangers in a foreign land, you too have an obligation to care for the stranger. Now, the word ger might be familiar to us, translated here as stranger, because our rabbis also use the word ger. They use the word ger as convert. Our rabbis use the word ger as a convert, because our rabbis living in exile had no idea of a non-Jewish people living among them in peace and fellowship. So they had to appropriate the word in a different way, and they use ger as a convert. And so for them, you shall love the ger, you shall love the convert, just as you love someone born Jewish. In biblical times, however, these were specifically non-Jews who were living among us. We don't have a relationship with them, they're not family, they're not kin, but we owe them, because we practice unwarranted love, just as God practices unwarranted love. We have an obligation to them, just as we have an obligation to God. And so I'll invite you to turn to page 2. And in our Torah portion it says, so what is it that God requires of you? But to fulfill the mitzvot and to walk in God's ways. And this is all in our Torah portion, Parashat Eikev this week. And our rabbis ask the question, what in the world does it mean to walk in God's ways? And here we are from the Talmud, Masechet Sota. We read, Rabbi Chana, son of Rabbi Hanina, says, what is the meaning of that which is written? After the Lord your God shall you walk. But is it actually possible for a person to follow divine presence? God doesn't have legs. How do we walk like God? Rather, Rabbi Chana bar Hanina says, the meaning is that one should follow the attributes of the Holy One, blessed be God. So Rabbi Chama provides several examples. Just as God clothes the naked, so too should you clothe the naked. Just as the Holy One, blessed be God, visits the sick, so too should you visit the sick. Just as the Holy One, blessed be God, consoles mourners, so too should you console mourners. Just as the Holy One, blessed be God, buries the dead, so too should you bury the dead. We have an obligation to care for others, and one of the central things we do as Jews is to walk in God's ways and to care for others, whether we know the person or not, whether we like them or not. We have an obligation of unwarranted love to care for other people. Now, the text that I didn't put in this document, partially because I wanted to keep it to one page, and partially because it's not in our Torah portion this week, appears in the book of Leviticus. And it says very specifically in the book of Leviticus, V'ahavta, you shall love. There it talks about you shall love your neighbor as yourself. V'ahavta l'reacha kamocha, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. And if you look very closely at the text, as I had the blessed opportunity to do this past summer through the Shalom Hartman Institute, when you have the opportunity to really look through the text, you shall love the neighbor yourself. God is not talking about the person living next to you. God is talking about your fellow Jews. We have an obligation toward our fellow Jews. Not love, not just this emotional thing. We have an obligation to care for them, to provide for them, to ensure their protection. And you can look it up, but you can believe me also. The list of obligations we have toward our fellow Jews is significantly longer than the list of obligations we have toward the stranger. The obligations exist in both cases. We practice unwarranted love in both cases, but the obligation toward our fellow Jews is significantly longer. So here we are now in the midst of the book of Deuteronomy. Moses is trying to give the last bit of wisdom, the central ideas of Judaism to our ancestors before they crossed the promised land without him. And what does he choose to focus on? He chooses to focus on this idea of love. And the unwarranted love that then leads to obligation, how we care for other people. Because at the end of the day, that which Jews and Judaism is most loyal to is God, the Torah, and our fellow Jews, and caring for others. Those are the central principles upon which Judaism is founded. And when we do that, when we show our love for God through observance of the mitzvot, when we care for fellow Jews with our fullness and our entirety, and when we care for the strangers living among us, then and only then do we get one of our chief rewards, which is the land of Israel. And so here I am at the very bottom of page 2, Deuteronomy chapter 11. Back to chapter 11. If then you faithfully keep all the instruction that I command you, loving the Lord your God, walking in all God's ways and holding fast to God, the Lord will dislodge before you all these nations. You will dispossess nations greater and more numerous than you. Every spot on which your foot treads shall be yours. Your territory shall extend from the wilderness to the Lebanon, and from the river, the Euphrates, to the western sea, which is the Mediterranean. No man shall stand up to you. The Lord your God will put the dread and the fear of you over the whole land in which you set foot, as God promised you. We live in complicated times. Yet, nevertheless, this commandment to practice unwarranted love remains. Loving God, caring for our fellow Jews, and loving the strangers who are among us. As we look across the ocean to Medinat Yisrael, to the state of Israel, our loyalty is not necessarily to Israel as a nation state in and of itself, because for 2,000 years we didn't know of this idea of a nation state. Our loyalty to the state of Israel is founded upon the idea that it is a state for Jews, that it's our brothers and sisters over there. We have an obligation to care for them. We have an obligation to protect them, just by the way as they have an obligation to care for us and to protect us, because they're our brothers and sisters. And we look at Jews all around North America and throughout the world. We have an obligation to care for them whether we know them or not, because in our practice of unwarranted love, we're obligated to care for those who are in need. We're obligated to care for the strangers among us. And we're obligated in our love for God, our warranted love for God. We're obligated to fulfill the mitzvot, a central idea of which is caring for those who are in need. This Shabbat of Parashat Eikev, let's remember what it is that Judaism stands for most of all. Loving God and showing our love for God through the observance of ritual. Loving God and showing our love for God by caring for the Jewish people wherever they are, whether that's the state of Israel or here. And by caring for the stranger and making sure he or she has what they need to survive. These are the central principles of Judaism to which we should be most loyal. Adonai oz le'amo yitain, Adonai yivarech et amo v'shalom. May God bless us with the strength to keep in mind that which God wants of us. And may God bless us, the state of Israel, and all the world with peace. And let us say together.